Hello, Warhammer 40K Imperial Knights players. In this video, we're going to be going over my thought process on how to build a competitive Knights list. So, in 10th edition Warhammer 40K, there are a few roles that you have to think about in order to win games. So, in order to win games, you have to score and you have to prevent your enemy from scoring. So, I broke all this down into four main roles. One of the ways you score points is standing on objectives, and I call that primaries. And another way to score points is what I call secondaries. And secondaries are, if you go tactical instead of fixed secondaries, you draw two cards every battle round, and you can either pay a CP to replace that card at the start of the turn, or you can gain a CP if you discard that card at the end of your turn. And so I think tactical secondaries are better because you can use it to gain CP if you need to. Also, there is that element of surprise that you get from playing tactical secondaries. If you're playing fixed secondaries, your opponent knows what secondaries you need to score, so it might be easier for them to plan on preventing you scoring your secondary points. Whereas if you play tactical and you're either scoring the secondaries or you're trading them out every turn, then it's harder for the opponent to know what your next move will be. And then we get to points denial. So there's a few ways to do this. One of them is move blocking. If you prevent your enemy from moving to an area of the board he needs to move, whether it be a quadrant of the board or your home objective, then you prevented your enemy from getting secondary points. So he's either going to have to pay CP or just forego the victory points for an extra CP. Now, another way to do it is out OCing. That works mainly for primary objectives, but it can also work for secondary objectives that require the opponent to take an objective that you're holding. If you have so much OC on an objective that the enemy cannot possibly put enough units to out OC you, then you have prevented the opponent from scoring a secondary. And the last way to deny points is right out killing. If you destroy his scoring units, then he can't score. So there's a lot of different ways to do points denial. So in the tables I have below, I'm not going to be discussing this in detail. And the last role is support. There are some units that generate CP for you, heal or repair your units, give your allied units buffs, or debuff the enemies by removing cover, for example. So there are certain units that I'll get to that are primarily support units and are taken for their support element, but there are other units that have support elements in their abilities that are just an added bonus to whatever their other main role is. So if you want to win games, you have to think about each unit that you want to take and think about the role that it's going to play in the game. Are you going to be standing on home objective? Are you going to be standing on no man's land? Are you going to be stickying objectives and moving through them? Are you going to be killing enemies in melee? Are you going to be killing enemies in range? So each unit that you take, it shouldn't be just, I think this is cool, or I think this is strong, or everybody else is bringing this unit. I don't know how to play it, but I'm just going to add it to my list. You can't think like that. Every unit you take, you have to know exactly what you're going to do with that unit before you even add it to the list. So let's go to primary. And for primary objectives, these units that I've chosen are not just for primaries. They can also assist in the scoring of secondary objectives, which are recover assets, extend battle lines, and defend strongholds, for example. So good units for primary objectives in general are units that have sticky objectives and indirect fire units for sitting on home base. Now, Knights as an army does not have a lot of indirect fire, but other armies like Guard and Eldar do have some pretty strong indirect fire units. So what we have here are Skitarii, the Rangers or the Vanguard. Now, me personally, I prefer Rangers for primary because they have scouts, which helps them move up the board. If you add a tech priest, they don't have scouts, but they still have sticky objectives. So Skitarii Rangers are great for scoring primary points. The next one is Armiger Helverin. The Armiger Helverin's very interesting because he gets an anti-fly 2+, which means that he scores a critical wound on a 2+ against opponents that have the keyword fly in the datasheet. But he only gets anti-fly 2+ if he is standing on an objective you control or within your deployment zone. So the Armiger Helverin, due to his ability, kind of lends itself to playing primary objectives, mainly defending your home base. Another great unit is Sisters in an Immolator. And if you're not playing Quest or Forge Pack, but you're playing Noble Lance, you don't get access to Skitarii, so Sisters are your best bet. I believe Sisters have sticky objectives, and even if they're in an Immolator, they also have sticky objectives inside the Immolator. And the cool thing about Sisters is that you can split them into 2 units. So you could take a unit of 10, put 5 of them in one Immolator, and you could put the other 5 in a different Immolator. That way, you can bring 2 tanks along with your army and only have 1 squad of Sisters. So that's an interesting use of Sisters, and I believe in Noble Lance, they are probably the top pick for allied units. Other agents are Navigator and the Watchmaster. Now, the cool thing about Navigator is that he prevents any deep strikes within 12 inches of him. So he's very good at screening, but he can be taken out by serious indirect fire. So that's one drawback to having a Navigator. But if you're facing an army that has indirect fire, you can always use the Navigator to score secondary objectives. Keep him in reserves and pop him out when you need him. And another good pick that I've heard some people discussing is the Watchmaster. And the reason the Watchmaster is interesting is that he can roll to set himself back up on the board after he's killed. So that makes him a little bit more durable for standing on home objective than the Navigator. And then there's Subductor squads and Voidsmen and other agents that you can bring. If you're going to sit them on home objectives, they all play a very similar purpose. One thing that I haven't seen being used in Knights list is using the Chimera. You are allowed to take a Chimera, but a lot of people choose not to take one. And I think that's because the Immolator is just better. Because if you're playing Noble Lance, unless you bring a Knight Acheron, you don't really have access to stripping cover. So that Immolator allows you to strip cover. And in very densely packed terrain, a lot of opponents will have the benefit of cover. So being able to strip cover is very important. And the Chimera does not give that ability. So another choice for a primary objective, and this is one of my favorite playstyles, is a knight that's used as an anchor. So you get a very strong and durable knight, and you can give him, in Noble Lance, Unyielding Paragon. which means that the opponent, his armor penetration is reduced by 1. And so it makes your unit a little bit more durable. In Quester Forge Pack, you can give your knight Omniscient Champion, which adds 4 wounds. So if you get one of the Toughness 13 knights, for example, the Knight Dominus class, like the Knight Valiant or the Knight Castellan, and use him as an anchor, you can just sit on an objective. Maybe you could start in your home objective and then later move on to one of the no man's land objectives. And as long as you're screening properly, your knight can just sit there and draw fire. And some knights are better than others at it. For example, I wouldn't anchor with a Canis Rex. And the reason why is Canis Rex cannot take an enhancement because he is an epic hero. And being a Questoris chassis, he only has 22 wounds with a toughness of 12. And he also does not get an invulnerable save in melee. So if you happen to be tagged in melee, he does not have an invulnerable save in melee. So Canis Rex would be a terrible pick if you're playing the anchor playstyle. If you do play this playstyle, I think the Knight Valiant is a pretty good pick. I think the Knight Atropos might be a decent pick. Maybe the Knight Paladin. A lot of people don't like to play the Paladin, but as I'll explain later, he has a pretty good support characteristic, and he does get to reroll 1 save roll. So he does have that inbuilt save reroll, and if you add Unyielding Paragon to him, and you add Ignoble Lance, a 6+ Feel No Pain, that goes to a 5+ if you're honored, a Knight Paladin could be a little bit durable. Personally, I don't play Noble Lance, and I don't play the Knight Paladin, but I'm saying hypothetically, you could use the Knight Paladin as a midboard anchor to sit on an objective for 1 turn. Now, an enhancement that allows your knight to score primaries very well is the Banner of Macarius Triumphant enhancement. Essentially, it gives one of your Titanic Knights sticky objectives. So that's another option. You can put it on the Lancer, for example. And the Lancer has a 14-inch move. So he could sticky an objective and go where he needs to the next turn. So some recommended units for scoring the secondaries of Bring It Down or Assassinate against monsters. The Assassinate secondary card requires you to kill a character. So characters could be monster type characters or they could be officer type characters. And what I mean by that is monster type characters usually move solo. They have very high durability characteristics, very high damage characteristics typically. I'm thinking demons here. They count towards assassinate. But there are officers, which are leaders that are linked to bodyguard units. And they are also characters, and they also give you assassinate points. So the first category we'll be talking about are the knights that will score you Bring It Down, which is destroying a monster or vehicle, and assassinate characters that are more focused on the bigger characters, the monster type characters that roll solo. Things like Angron, Shalaxi, Mortarion. So the Knight Valiant is pretty good. His main weapon, the Thunder Coil Harpoon, has anti-vehicle and monster 4-up on it. It has 24 strength, which is higher than any other toughness in the game. And it does a flat 12 damage. So the Knight Valiant is pretty good in general purpose. One opponent that he would not be good against would be Magnus. Because Magnus has 1 CP, blank damage. And blanks really counter one-shot, super high damage attacks. The next knight on the list is the Knight Atropos. His ability is +1 on the hit roll against monsters and vehicles. And he has other abilities that give him buffs against Titanic and Towering models. So the Knight Atropos is good for countering other knights, Wraith Knights in Eldar. I believe there's a Tau model that's toughness 11 that's also towering, but nobody takes that model. So Knight Atropos is pretty much good against enemy Imperial Knights armies, some Chaos Knights armies that decide to take one of the bigger knights, even though most Chaos Knights players choose to take War Dog spam. And the Atropos is good against demons. And then the next one on the list is Knight Castellan. Knight Castellan is another Knight Dominus class, just like the Knight Valiant. And he gets an ability that gives reroll damage 1 against monsters and vehicles. So that makes his swingy damage attacks a little less swingy. Since his range of 72 inches is quite long, even though he's pretty useless in melee, he's a decent pick if you play him and know how to protect him from getting tagged in melee. Now, the most popular pick among Knights players is, of course, Canis Rex. Canis Rex has the highest damage dealing melee attacks, and he's also quite decent with his range attacks. So Canis Rex is also a good pick. If you do pick him, I would play him cagey and try to keep him safe because he's not the most durable knight. But when he does hit, he hits like a freight train. So he's a great pick for the bring it down and assassinate secondaries. And last on the list is Knight Lancer. Knight Lancer is great because he has a 4+ invulnerable save in melee and range. And he has very high damage on his melee attacks, and he has a 14-inch range. So even though he's a melee knight, he can go where he needs to go. And now knights that have super heavy walkers, which are all the bigger knights, they can walk through walls. So the Lancer has great mobility, so he's good for secondary objectives in general, but I think he's a decent pick for bring it down and assassinate. Next up, we go to the secondary objective of assassinate, but this time against officers. So let's say you're playing against Eldar or Astra Militarum in particular, maybe even Death Guard to a certain extent, but Death Guard characters are very durable. These are units that are good at sniping leaders off of their bodyguard units. So the keyword here is precision on their attacks. The Vindicare Assassin is, of course, the top pick for assassinating leaders out of groups. The Calidus Assassin is one of the best assassins. I think the best assassin and the most picked one out there in competitive list. And the Calidus Assassin does have precision on the ranged attack, which is also Torrent, meaning it auto hits, and the melee attack. So if there's a weaker officer that you want to take out, you can bring a Calidus Assassin and maybe pick off a leader for a few victory points. And last in the list, we have the Skitarii Ranger. And the Skitarii Ranger, even though it's not primarily a sniper unit, it has one model that has the Transuranic Arquebus. And this weapon has heavy and precision at strength 7. Strength 7 is higher than, I believe, most leaders that can be attached to units, except for like Primarchs and things like that. But for most officers in Astra Militarum and some of the Eldar leaders, a horde of Skitarii Rangers, you can take up to 5. You can have 5 Transuranic Arquebus shots going into an enemy officer, and that might take it out. So next up, we have some recommendations for location-based secondaries. So these are ones that have you standing in certain quadrants, have you standing in the middle of the board, or have you standing in the enemy deployment zone, or 9 inches from a board edge, or wholly inside a ruin. Some of the better units are the Calidus Assassin. The Calidus Assassin is a small model, and you can easily hide her in a ruin and pick her up at the end of the opponent's next turn, and then place her down somewhere else to score a different secondary if needed. So the Calidus Assassin is great for location-based secondaries. Skitarii Rangers are also great for location-based secondaries. And the reason that that is that they're a pretty cheap unit. They're like regular infantry units, and so they're very expendable. And against certain armies, they might not be doing a lot of damage. And when you do come across those opponents, maybe you're better off just moving them to where you can score a secondary and just sit there in action. The next up is any knight with Mysterious Guardian. Of course, there are better knights for this, but a knight with Mysterious Guardian can teleport once per battle anywhere on the board. And the cool thing is that knights can action and shoot. Other units can't do that. That's why if you want to place a knight somewhere in order to get a good firing lane on an opponent and you happen to draw a location-based secondary, you can use Mysterious Guardian and he can help you action to do the location-based secondary, and he can also shoot. So that's another option. Mysterious Guardian is an enhancement in the Noble Lance detachment. And finally, we have the Sisters out of the Immolator. Now, previously, I mentioned that Sisters in the Immolator are good for primaries. So here, for location-based secondaries, I put Sisters out of an Immolator. And the reason I put that is because you might not want to waste the Immolator's firing by actioning with the Immolator with the Sisters inside. You might want to pop the Sisters out, use them to action, and use the Immolator to fire on something that needs its cover stripped. So you can action with an Immolator if you want, but the Sisters, they're expendable units, so they might be a little bit better at location-based secondaries. Now, there is a chance they can get killed because you might split your Sisters and you only have 5 models, but if you can place them to do a location-based secondary that's in a relatively safe area, or even if they're not safe, in a kind of detached area from the main heat of battle, then it's a good thing, because if the opponent has a melee army, they might have a hard time trying to kill the Sisters to deny you points. They might have to move important units out of the heat of battle and distract themselves by killing the Sisters. And you might lose victory points, but if it's an important unit that they're drawing away from the main fight in the middle of the board to go 9 inches back into their own deployment zone to try to kill some Sisters who are actioning there, it might yield you a benefit because now you've wasted their turn. And that might allow you to win a primary objective or deny them points somewhere else. So lastly, we come to support units. And mainly the support units are either fixing or buffing. Fixing is for Questor Forge Pack, and buffing is for both detachments. So the Knight Dominus class, the Valiant and the Castellan, give an aura that armigers within 6 inches have the benefit of cover. So I wouldn't take a Knight Dominus just for the aura, but it is definitely something you should remember if you do play a Knight Dominus, that armigers do have benefit of cover within 6 inches. Next up, we have Knight Castigator, who has probably the best bondsman ability among all knights. he gives an armiger sustained hits and bonus AP. And I'm going to skip to the bottom of the list. If you take Mythic Hero enhancement in the Noble Lands detachment, that allows you to bond a second armiger. So a Knight Castigator with 2 Helverins bonded might be doing quite a lot of damage. The next up is Night Warden. Night Warden is quite unpopular, and the reason is Canis Rex costs 450 points. Night Warden also costs 450 points and does a lot less damage than Canis Rex. But the Bondsman ability gives -1 to incoming damage for your bonded armiger. And what people usually do with the Night Warden is they'll take Mythic Hero on the Night Warden and run Warglaive spam. And just move your Warglaives up the board with the Warden, bonding them so that the Warglaives take less damage. And I would say that the Warden might have a niche role, but only in Noble Lands. I think the Night Warden is absolutely terrible in Questor Forge Pact because his Bondsman ability does absolutely nothing to help Skitarii if you use that 1 CP stratagem to bond an armiger and a Skitarii unit, and you can't get the Mythic Hero enhancement. So the Warden is pretty garbage in Questor Forge Pact. But in Noble Lands, he does have that niche use of Warglaive spam. Next up on the list, we have the Knight Paladin. The Knight Paladin is generally disliked, but I think that his Bondsman ability is decent. He can give an armiger lethal hits and lance. So if the Knight Paladin bonds an armiger Warglaive, for example, he can fire his Melta with lethal hits, he can fire his Stubber with lethal hits, and then he can charge and fight with Lance. And Lance is a weapon ability that gives you +1 to wound if you are charging. So using this Bondsman ability, an armiger Warglaive might be able to hit above its weight. So the Knight Paladin does have an okay support Bondsman ability. Next up, we have Knight Crusader. His Bondsman ability isn't great. He's taken for other reasons, but his Bondsman ability gives an armiger +1 to hit, which is nice on Warglaives, it's nice on Helverins. It's an okay use that you can use in your command phase every turn. Next up, we have Knight Acheron. His Bondsman ability is terrible. His Bondsman ability allows an armiger to apply battle shock tests on the opponent. It's not very good, but his ability for himself can strip cover from an opponent that he has hit with his flamer weapon. So the Knight Acheron, although not being a very good knight, does have a support role. Next up, we have 2 Tech Priests. The Tech Priest Dominus and the Tech Priest Manipulus. And they can both repair knights in Questor Forge Pact detachment. What that means is the detachment rule allows knights to repair 1 lost wound in the command phase, but if there is a Tech Priest nearby, it instead repairs D3 wounds, which means you have a minimum of 1 wound repaired, up to 3 wounds repaired, and an average of 2 wounds repaired. So every turn, having a Tech Priest close to a knight can give you an average 1 extra wound. Is it great? Do you take Tech Priest for that reason? No, but it's just something nice to have that you should not forget about if you are playing Questor Forge Pact. The Tech Priest Dominus has a great ability. He gives 5+ Feel No Pain to a unit he's leading. And he can lead a lot of units in Adeptus Mechanicus army, but in Questor Forge Pact, he's limited to leading Skitarii Rangers and Skitarii Vanguards. A 5+ Feel No Pain increases a Skitarii's survivability from 33% with its 5+ Invulnerable to 55% with the Invulnerable and the Feel No Pain. So it's kind of nice to have. The Tech Priest Manipulus gives lethal hits to the unit that it's leading. And once per battle, he gives his unit that he's leading a 4-up invulnerable save. So durability-wise, the Tech Priest Dominus gives a better durability support bonus to its Skitarii units, but the Manipulus does give lethal hits to Skitarii, and that's okay if you're using your Skitarii to shoot a lot. If you're not using them to action, for example, and you're using your other big knights to action, and your Skitarii are there sitting and shooting, then the lethal hits might be nice. But even with the 5-up invulnerable save, they're not terribly durable. And so I prefer the Dominus personally over the Manipulus if I'm bringing a Tech Priest. And down here, we already discussed this, but the Mythic Hero enhancement allows you to bond 2 armigers with a Questoris Knight instead of bonding just 1 armiger. So if you want a support knight, then Mythic Hero is a pretty good enhancement. These are my recommendations for the knights that will fit into a particular role for point scoring. But next up, we're going to have another section where I list out the units that are available for knights for just general purpose gameplay. So generally, if you're shooting or fighting, there are going to be 3 types of enemies that I broke up. So the first is infantry. And by infantry, I mean toughness 5 and down, generally taken in blobs of 10 to 20. Some of them, for more elite armies, are taken in blobs of 6, for example, but generally toughness 5 and down, I just call it infantry, even if they're not infantry. And then next up, we have toughness 6 to toughness 11. And I just call it light monsters and vehicles. They might not be vehicles, they might not be monsters, but generally just things that are more durable and less hoardy than infantry. Things that might have 2 or 3 or 4 wounds instead of 1 or 2 wounds. And then last up, we have heavy monsters and vehicles. And these are units that generally have toughness 12 or higher. Now, things like demons that have toughness 11, they will also fit into heavy monsters and vehicles. Yes, they have toughness 11, but they have other things that make them durable, and they generally have a lot of wounds. So, demons, bigger Astra Militarum tanks, other knights, that one unit that Chaos Space Marines has, which is essentially a Chaos version of a knight. The thing with toughness 13 and 24 wounds, I forgot what it's called. The thing that has a skull thrower. Yeah, I have never seen one in play, ever. But just in case an opponent brings one big stompy unit, you want to be prepared and have something to face off with it. So first of all, let's talk about clearing infantry. We got agents, sisters, Skitarii. These are your main units that are also going to be scoring your primary objectives, standing on circles, but they do have small arms fire that can clear out enemy infantry if needed. These are going to be your main infantry clearing units. Next up, we have Knight Acheron. He has a flamer with 2d6 attacks. In Quester Forge Pack detachment, you can overwatch with 1 weapon on 1 knight. So the Knight Acheron does play a good infantry clearing role. He also does have a heavy bolter with sustained hits and 3 attacks, so that helps him clear more infantry. And he has a Reaper Chainsword. Most knights that actually have a decent melee weapon can choose from strike or sweep. So a chainsword has more infantry clearing sweep attacks than the gauntlets or the hand weapons. So the Acheron cannot choose between a chainsword and a hand, unlike the Questoris Knights, he just has a Reaper Chainsword. And so I would say the Knight Acheron is a pure clearing infantry type of unit. And since his Flamer is strength 8, I would say that he's more of fighting heavy infantry. He wouldn't be as good against light infantry with 1 wound, but against targets that have 2 wounds, the Knight Acheron is perfect. Next up, we have Knight Valiant. Knight Valiant has a Flamer weapon with 3d6 shots. And again, in Questor Forge Pack, he can use the stratagem Thronegeist Fury, which is essentially a 1 weapon on 1 knight Overwatch. The Knight Valiant also has some shoulder-mounted cannons that are good for infantry clearing. They have Blast. He does have Titanic Feet. I wouldn't really try to put him in melee, but the nice thing is that if a bunch of chaff tags the Knight Valiant in melee, since he has few blast weapons, he can still shoot into combat. So with the Thronegeist Fury Overwatch, his regular Flamer attack, and being able to fire into combat when tagged by infantry, I think the Knight Valiant is great at clearing infantry. Next up, we have the Knight Castigator. The Knight Castigator is a flexible unit, just like the Knight Valiant, but he does have an 18-shot Gatling cannon. So with the Gatling cannon and his melee attacks, he could possibly do a lot of damage to Horde armies. The Knight Castigator is great. Next up, we have Knight Warden. He has the Avenger Gatling cannon. And that's very similar to the Castigator Gatling cannon. The benefit of the Castigator Gatling cannon is that it's twin-linked, so it's better against a little bit heavier targets as well. But the Knight Warden is a great choice for clearing infantry. Next up, we have Knight Crusader. The Knight Crusader is really interesting. He is amazing at clearing infantry because not only does he have the Avenger Gatling cannon, but he also has the choice between taking a rapid fire battle cannon and a big thermal cannon. If he takes a rapid fire battle cannon, he gets many shots when he is 36 inches away from the opponent. So with the Avenger Gatling cannon and the rapid fire battle cannon, the Knight Crusader can do a lot of infantry clearing. And last up, we have the Eversor Assassin. The Eversor Assassin is one of the ally choices you can take, and his primary role is running into swarms of enemies and completely decimating them. He's a great assassin to bring if your army is generally lacking other infantry clearing options. Next up, we have units that are good for clearing light monsters and vehicles. We have the Armigers. The Armiger Helverin is good against anything that's flying, and the Armiger Helverin has 2 autocannons that do 4 shots each. So he has 8 shots at strength 9. He kind of has low AP, -1 AP, but each shot does 3 damage. So you want to use him against a little bit heavier targets. That's why I put him in this section and not clearing infantry, because you'll have a lot of wasted damage if you're using Helverins against opponents that have 1 wound. But if the enemy takes a full Horde army and you happen to have Armiger Helverins, you can use it against infantry. It's just not the most efficient. But the Helverins are very good against light monsters and vehicles. Next up, we have Knight Paladin. Knight Paladin can take a rapid fire battle cannon that has strength 10. It's the same rapid fire battle cannon that you can get on the Crusader, but on the Paladin, you don't get a choice to take a thermal cannon. You have to take the rapid fire battle cannon. So being a strength 10 weapon, it's okay against light monsters and vehicles. It has a blistering amount of shots, and so you're bound to do some damage. The Knight Paladin also gets the option in melee to take a chainsword or a hand. So he's good at ranged against light monsters and vehicles, and in melee, he can do a lot of attacks to lower toughness targets, or he can do fewer attacks that do more damage to larger targets. So the Knight Paladin is quite flexible. Next up, we have the Knight Crusader. And the Knight Crusader, even though I mentioned he's good at clearing infantry, he's also very good at clearing light monsters and vehicles. And if you're going to take him for clearing out monsters and vehicles, I would take him with a thermal cannon instead of the rapid fire battle cannon. Whereas the rapid fire battle cannon will work against light monsters and vehicles and infantry. You have to kind of choose what role you want your Crusader to take. But he is a ranged only knight. His Titanic feet aren't going to do anything in melee, so you have to kind of play him carefully and watch out for that. Next up, we have the Knight Castigator. While the Knight Castigator is really good at clearing infantry, he also hits hard against heavier targets up to toughness 11. And the reason is he has Twin Linked, which lets him reroll all the wounds on his Gatling cannon. So the Castigator is an okay choice for clearing things that are heavier than infantry as well. Next up, we have Knight Gallant. Knight Gallant is a melee-only knight, but the difference that his weapon profiles in melee have versus the other knights that are not melee focused like the Knight Gallant is that the Knight Gallant's melee weapons have more attacks. So his weaker sweep profile can be used against lighter stuff, and his stronger strike profile can be used against heavier stuff. So the Knight Gallant, if you bring him and know how to play him, he is decent in melee at clearing out light monsters and vehicles. Next up, we have Knight Errant. Knight Errant has a thermal cannon that's exactly the same as one of the Crusader's options. And he also has the melee options as well, being a Questoris Knight. So he's pretty decent at clearing light monsters and vehicles up to toughness 11. And finally, we have Knight Castellan. He is a ranged only knight. And unlike the Valiant, a lot of his weapons have blast, so he can't even shoot into combat. He has Titanic feet, so he can't fight. He can't shoot into combat. He is purely ranged. One of his weapons is a Plasma Decimator that can do strength 8 to strength 9 shots. So he does have a capacity to fight light monsters and vehicles. And while we are discussing the Knight Castellan, let's go over to our final category of clearing heavy monsters and vehicles. Now, the Knight Castellan, he has the plasma in one hand, and in the other hand, he has the Volcano Lance. The Volcano Lance has strength 18 with D3 shots at a 72-inch range with minus 5 AP. He is amazing against medium and super heavy targets. Next up, we have Knight Valiant. He has the Thunder Coil Harpoon that has a strength 24, anti-monster and vehicle 4-up with devastating wounds. And both the Castellan and the Valiant have the Shieldbreaker missile launchers that have strength 12 shots at a 72-inch range. So the Valiant and the Castellan are very good picks if you plan on fighting heavy monsters and vehicles. Next up is Knight Atropos. And Knight Atropos has the highest damage among all Questoris and Cerastus Knights at range. One of his weapons is a Last Cutter weapon that's similar to the Preceptor and Canis Rex weapons. And the other one is a grab weapon that has strength 16. The Knight Atropos is a dedicated anti-tank knight. Next up, we have Canis Rex. Canis Rex has a last weapon for his range, and he has the best hand weapon in the whole game. He has Freedom's Hand, and it has 5 attacks at strength 20, and his ability is that he crits on 5 up, and he has sustained hits 1. So Canis Rex has the best hand melee profile among all the knights. He is amazing against heavy monsters and vehicles if you can get the drop on it. Next up, we have Knight Lancer. Knight Lancer is great against heavy monsters and vehicles. And not only does he do good damage with his melee lance, but he also has a 4-up invulnerable save in melee. He has the best invulnerable save in melee among all the knights. And so the good thing about the Lancer is that he is more likely, also being a Cerastus Knight with 25 wounds, to survive an attack. And if he survives an attack, that means he gets to activate and hit the enemy on the enemy's turn. So that's the interesting thing about the Knight Lancer. He is very good against heavy monsters and vehicles, and one of the most durable knights. Next up, we have the Knight Preceptor. The Knight Preceptor is very unpopular because he is like the poor man's Canis Rex. He has a last cutter weapon, and he has a choice of a chainsword or a hand, but compared to Canis Rex, he doesn't have the crits on 5 up. So it makes him a lot less useful. Canis Rex also can use a stratagem for 0 CP, whether it's a command point reroll, a tank shock, or some other stratagem. If you're a Noble Lance, maybe rotate Ion Shields. The Knight Preceptor does not have that ability. So he's like just the worst version of Canis Rex, and that's probably why nobody takes him. But if you have a Preceptor and want to play him for some reason, he's okay at clearing heavy monsters and vehicles with his range weapon and his hand. But he just falls short among all the other knights on this list. Last up, we have the Knight Gallant. I mentioned that the Knight Gallant is good against light monsters and vehicles, but he's also good against heavy monsters and vehicles because he has both the chainsword and the hand. And his hand does more attacks in melee than any of the other knights that have a similar standard Questoris hand. So that makes the Knight Gallant okay against heavy monsters and vehicles if he survives. In Noble Lance, for 2 CP, you can give one of your knights fight on death. So you could save 2 CP for that stratagem, and even if your Knight Gallant dies, he can fight on death and deal a lot more damage. So I would personally not play Knight Gallant in Questor Forge Pact, but in Noble Lance he has some use. So here is my breakdown for building a winning knights list. Here are recommended units for the different purposes that you're going to need in a game. And personally, for me, I would take 1 knight for clearing heavy monsters and vehicles, and I would take 1 knight for clearing light monsters and vehicles. I'll take 2 of the bigger knights, and I will have at least 1 unit for each list of primary, secondary, bring it down and assassinate monsters, secondary, assassinate officers, secondary location, and support. That's my personal preference of how I would like to build. And the reason why I'll take 2 bigger knights, whether it's 2 Dominus class, 2 Cerastus class knights, is that I like to have a little bit of padding, meaning that if one of my bigger knights goes down, I'm not completely ruined for the game. I have something backing it up. that also fills a similar purpose. What I personally like to bring for Quest for Forge Pact is Knight Valiant. I love that the Knight Valiant is good at clearing infantry and also decent against most heavy monsters and vehicles, with the exception of things that have blanks, like Magnus, Rogaldorn, and Tyrannofex. But that's why we bring another bigger knight and some Warglaves that have melta damage, so that if we do come against an army that's fielding a Magnus or a lot of Rogaldorns or 3 Tyrannofexes, then my Valiant isn't completely useless. For our final point, we're going to discuss a list that was played by Brian Jones at the Cherokee tournament recently. He brings in Noble Lance Detachment 1 Canis Rex, 1 Knight Atropos, 2 Immolators with 5 sisters in each. Remember, I said sisters can be split into 2 different Immolators. And he brings a Subductor squad from Imperial Agents to sit on his home objective. And he brings 1 Armiger Helverin and 3 Armiger Warglaves and a Calidus Assassin. I think that list is great. And the reason why I think that list is great is because he's playing Noble Lance, the Immolators are his best bet at stripping cover. So the fact that he has 2 of them means that if one goes down, he also has another Immolator to strip cover, and maybe he wants to strip cover from 2 different targets. It's nice to have doubles. Now in Guard, people say if you can take 1, take 3. In Knights, things cost a little bit more. Sometimes you can't afford to take 3 of a unit. So I think that having 2 Immolators is okay. And I think that having 1 Atropos and 1 Canis Rex is okay, because they both do very heavy damage against heavy monsters and vehicles. And when you use their sweep profile, or on the last cutter, I believe it's dissipated, then you have more shots at a lower strength for taking out more hordes. And so both Canis Rex and Atropos is very flexible in that aspect. And although they're not dedicated infantry killers, he doesn't suffer at all because he has the Immolators. The Calidus Assassin is great for secondary objectives, and it's a very popular pick for competitive tournament lists. So that's another good thing. With that said, thank you for watching this video, and I hope that whether you're a new player or an experienced tournament player, this list can help you organize your thoughts and plan out your list so that you can score the most victory points and do the best at your next event or your next casual game. So, thank you for watching and have a great day.